Mark's going to talk about the leafy vegetables and harvesting them. So Mark, are you ready?
Gardener Mark, thank you. I'm Mark. I'm a Fairfax County Master Gardener, and I'm an avid vegetable gardener. And today I'd like to talk about harvesting cool season crops. On the cover, just some examples from that I took photos. Leaf lettuce in a rail box on my deck, ready to pick, and on the right, turnip greens, a turnip root, and some arugula. Next slide, please. Again, talking about cool season crops, talking about when and how to harvest, record keeping, and then there's a slide with links, with a list of resources and hyperlinks to go look at those. Next slide, please. Next slide. Who's doing the slide control?
Can you see that, Mark?
I see.
There it goes.
Yeah,
I think with all of us on the camera, I think it's taken a lot of bandwidth. So I think it's just the system is very slow.
Okay.
That's why I turned my video off.
So I'll start by talking, using a slide I used earlier in the year when we were talking about planning or seeding for cool season crops, just to refresh our memories on what we mean by cool season crops. As the name implies, these are veggies that can handle cold temperatures, but more than being robust enough to handle the cool temperatures, many of these crops need the cold temperatures for germination and development early in the season. In other words, if it's too warm, the seeds won't germinate or the plants will be stunted and not develop. They range from hardy, kale would be an example of a very hardy cool season crop that can overwinter, handle freezes, to semi-hardy, like lettuce, in freeze, it kills them, or in high heat. So there's a range of hardiness in that group. This includes many or most root crops and leafy vegetables, and they're usually the first and last to plant in the garden year. And the life cycles of these plants can range from weeks. For example, turnips we'll talk about are pretty quick to grow, and arugula is a leafy type that's pretty quick to come out. Carrots are a bit slower, as we're seeing in our gardens now. So a real range there. Here, a last note, some of these can handle warmer weather. I mean, kale and chard, for example, can keep going, but the leaves may get harder, tougher, and require more cooking time. Some of the deterioration is quite rapid, like with leaf lettuce. Once it goes to flower and seed, it becomes bitter in taste and is inedible. Next slide, please. So one thing I wanted to mention briefly is the term days to maturity or days to harvest. And I've got a couple handy, pictures here of seed packets that I use. These are two vegetables that I'll show in the briefing on different slides. Your seed catalogs and your seed packets will include this, either as days to harvest or days to maturity. This is very helpful, particularly for germinating, for timing and for planting your garden, when you need to, if you're starting seeds indoors or outdoors, when to put it in the ground and how long it will take to germinate. And then there's usually a range for when you'll start seeing the fruits of your labor. And I say range, emphasize that, it's not always reliable. It depends on a lot of other factors. How healthy the seedling is, how good the potting media was, the soil media that you used, fertilization, cold, maybe the weather got colder than you expected. So there's a number of factors that can, lead to success or failure, or things might just take longer because plants slow down because it gets too cold. So that's something to pay attention to, but it's not, written in stone that the turnips are going to come up in 30 days. Next slide, please. I mentioned record keeping. This is a cutout from a spreadsheet I keep to keep track of what I bought, when I bought it, etc. But the thing I wanted to point to is I'm keeping track of when I put the seed in. And in all cases of my cool season, I did not plan anything out. I put the seeds in the ground on the dates you see in the direct sow first column. And then I'm keeping track of when I've started to harvest. And this, of course, is to help with planning next year and kind of assess your results with seeds and figure out, why things went well and why things maybe failed or didn't go so well compared to the prior year. And you can see I've been harvesting. Again, this is an example for my garden. And I also show where I did a second sow because the first one was either kind of disappointing or I'm just doing a succession set. I note here that the results can vary from year to year, like I said, because of weather or something else you did right or wrong. But it's good to keep good records of what you did and how it went. Next slide, please. So general harvesting tips. Most crops, and this is true of cool season crops, attain peak quality while ripening on the plant. So, if you harvest something too early, it might, it depends on the plant. It might affect the quality of the taste quality or edibility. I mentioned the time to harvest and whatnot, but there's kind of an experience and subtle clues that indicate peak quality based on what you did last year, what your neighbor told you, or what you read online to look for. So there's great resources out there about harvesting tips, but these are things you can also put in your notes in your log. And I'll mention some of this when I show pictures of crops. Bigger is better is not always true. One example I think of that's amusing is the giant zucchini we sometimes see where people are celebrating the size of a zucchini. Well, it reduces the edibility, or it's not as sweet or whatnot. So bigger is not always better in terms of harvesting. And if you leave things on the plant too long or in the ground too long, it consumes energy that is needed to produce newer leaves or veggies. That's a very general statement, but don't assume bigger is better. Like for a turnip, if you leave it in too long and it gets hot, it becomes inedible. Try to harvest early in the morning. There's things that happen at night that enrich the flavor of the veggie, and if you harvest during a hot day, it can cause things to wilt, whatnot. So that's kind of a general tip. Doesn't mean you can't harvest any other time of the day, but that's a guideline. Use well sharpened, clean tools. I show the kind of sharp pointed pruners that I use. Well sharpened so you're not ripping, clean so that you're not causing any disease to spread. So wiping your pruners is good. Another tip I have is as part of your garden plan, you know when you want to take something out or that it's past its peak, and think you'll have a plan for what you're going to replace it with depending on the size of your garden or container. So, you know, when you pull it up, what else can you put in either as a transplant or as a seed looking toward the warmer season? The other tip is, if you're growing something new or different, is to learn about, because if you get an excess of crops like turnips or, you know, whatever, or kale, learn about storing and preserving. You know, how long will it keep in the refrigerator? How long, you know, some things keep on the counter okay for a few days. And then preservation options, like with kale or chard, you can parboil it and put it in the freezer. Next slide, please. Just checking my clock here. So what's ready to harvest? Here I've got a picture from a raised bed by backyard on a nice day. And on the left, there's some arugula. That's an early one, Italian. I show some kale, the lacinato, if I pronounce that right. They call it dinosaur kale, which is kind of cool. Then you can see some carrots popping up. These were all planted in mid-March around the same time. And you can see that the arugula is, I mean, it's going to start flowering. It's a fast grower and will start to flower. The kale is somewhat behind that, but that can be harvested for salads. The smaller leaves are more tender. And the carrots need more time, and that's not surprising. Just a kind of an example of a observation of where we're at. Next slide, please. So I've got a slide on kale, so there may be a little bit of overlap with what Heather's going to talk about. So I just mentioned the dinosaur kale and other kales. If you can cut off the small leaves and they're tender enough and maybe sweet enough to use in salads. The more mature leaves, the larger leaves, take longer. Kale will benefit from frost or cold, sweetens up the leaves. Although now with these hot days, that will toughen the leaves a bit. You know, as a plant matures, you kind of pick off 2 or 3 of the outer leaves. Oh, I'm not muted. I see a chat note.
No, I can hear you good, Mark.
We had a chat note asking when the picture was taken.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I can unmute everyone if they want to.
Oh, I'll just answer the question. Can you hear me, Teresa? What might be on your end? Huh. That photo was taken yesterday. Or all the photos in here, or most of them, I took yesterday or this morning. So let's move on. Again, Heather's going to talk about this. Just the preparation tips. The larger, older leaves on the outside, you know, they're less desirable for salads. They need to be steamed, sauteed, or, you know, cooked in a stew like a cabbage. 1 week in the refrigerator, and then I mentioned you can parboil chard, an example on kale, for freezing if you've got more than you can use or will keep in the refrigerator. You know, the plants will keep going, the kale and chard as examples, but the leaves get tougher, but they may still be edible when cooked long enough. Or I don't do smoothies, so I'm not sure what the most desirable for that application is. Next slide, please. So let's talk about turnips a bit. These pictures are from the garden from yesterday, and I've planted two types of turnips, a baby Japanese called Mikado, and more traditional size, a purple top white turnip. And the one on the right side, that's an example of the baby turnip. That's about the size of a walnut, or golf ball would be a good analogy. You can also see a lot of nice looking greens, not a lot of pest damage showing. Next slide, please.
Mark, can I ask a question first?
Sure.
In the picture on the left, what are the wires for? Is that to lay cloth over if it's going to freeze, or?
Yeah, and I'll mention this again later. That's to support crop cover, or floating row covers, whatever the right word is. And that's kind of just a do-it-yourself method versus PVC that you bend over. There's a lot of different ways. So I do that for protection from pests including animals that like to dig and do other things in my beds, and bugs. These are cold tolerant veggies though, so it's more for pest control and animal, including keeping animals out. Okay. Next slide, please. So let's talk about harvesting turnips. We can harvest both the roots and the greens. I grew turnips for the first time last fall, and they did really well. I had more turnips, I was giving away to the neighbors, both varieties that I mentioned. But, I'd heard of turnip greens. You can take the leafy tops off when they're 4 to 6 inches, but you don't need to be precise. But if you're wanting to harvest both the roots and the greens, some people grow turnips just for the greens. I'm doing both. But if you want to preserve the root, you don't want to take off all of the leaves. You just take off a couple if you want to harvest both. These baby turnips are really quick developing roots. So those I pick when they're walnut size, and that was about 30 days. So if you leave them in too long, though, like I said, they might toughen up as the heat comes. The purple top, or the larger ones, take longer to develop, and you want to see some a tennis ball size. You hand pull the smaller roots, like I'm just lifting these baby turnips out of the ground. But for larger root vegetables, or ones that are deeper, like a carrot, you want to loosen the soil either with a spading fork or some other tool like a weed picker. Kind of loosen it up so that you don't rip it apart. Because I've actually pulled, I've had a carrot, they kind of crack apart if the ground's a little bit hard. They like loose soil to begin with, but just a tip. Don't jerk it out of the ground. Try loosening it up a bit. Don't leave turnips in the ground too long in hot weather, because they won't be edible if you do that. In the fall, and this is a good fall crop, you can leave it in the ground until early winter. You can actually cut off the leaves and store the turnips in the ground. And you can store these larger turnips in a root cellar. I know not many of us have root cellars for months. And there, interestingly, it's recommended that you leave them dirty because that protects them in storage. Next slide. Try to do closing thoughts because I'm probably over time a bit. Other thoughts: protection, prevention. You can see in the lower right, I've got that crop cover cloth. That's a good one. Draped over those wires to protect, in this case, less against the cold because it's cool season crops, but to prevent pests and protect. But you can use this if you I've put out some tomatoes already. So you can also use it for frost protection. So there's pest protection and protection against cold weather or hot weather, kind of just as thoughts to preserve things for harvesting. I mentioned bolting, flowering, seed saving. I show in the lower left a picture of kale that's gone to flower. And if you're really into seed saving, you can let these go and then harvest it, let them dry out. I don't know the exact steps, and save the seeds for next year. I have not done that, but this is an example of kale going to flower, not yet to seed. The leaves are still edible though, but it's a question of, geez, do I want to keep these crazy looking kale plants going as it gets hotter and they get tougher, or just pull them up and put in some hot season crops? I mentioned multiple seedings of fast growers like turnips, arugula, or heat tolerant, and the top picture shows the kale that I've harvested. Actually, I planted last October for Teresa's benefit. It overwintered, and this is the kind of curly leafed. But you can see on that top picture, I seeded some new kale in mid-March, and it's coming up nicely. Again, this was like yesterday or the day before. And I'll cut these old plants down to give space for the new guys, which I've already thinned out a bit. I mentioned transplanting. That's not appropriate for the things I've talked about today, but transplanting is a possibility with things like parsley that you grew last fall. It's a biennial, and then it will go to flower and attract butterflies. That's just a kind of a tip or a fun thing to do with parsley as kind of a cool season. I mentioned the pruning of kale. And then the other thing is, think about, based on what you've accomplished this spring with cool season, or what you've heard from me today about cool season crops in the fall, and plan for fall seed sowing. So with that, sorry, I went a little over time, but I'll note with this resources slide is, except for the Rodale's Encyclopedia on Organic Gardening, all my sources are, that I mentioned here, are Cooperative Extension at state universities, just excellent. You do a search, Virginia Tech's also among those, and University of Maryland, but there's just wonderful reference material out there at the Extension Service websites.
Okay. Kathy's going to talk about harvesting kale. Heather, I'm
right,
sorry.
Right.
Heather.
Hi. Yeah, okay. So I was going to talk about harvesting kale. I think Mark covered most of what I was going to say. Just a little bit about how you actually harvest the kale. You should start at the base of the plants and work upwards, and you can cut cutting leaves off. And as long as you leave 4 or 5 leaves, the plant will continue to grow. So it's one that you can harvest from, throughout the season. And that's sort of about it. I think Mark covered everything else. Please, anyone jump in if they have additional information. So the squash vine borer is a really difficult pest, and most people don't know that they've got a problem until all of their vines start dying, and at that point it's sort of too late. The larvae are inside your plant and have are killing it pretty often very quickly. And the picture on the right here is what the adult moth looks like. And then there's some pictures of the larva and one of them inside the plant. So most people that I know, and guys jump in if this is incorrect, once this happens, the best thing you can do is just kind of pull all your vines and destroy them, because you've already got the problem there. But there are ways that you can avoid or try to avoid getting this pest in your zucchinis and pumpkins. If you plant very early in the spring, the vines can be strong enough to resist the pest if they're attacked later on in the summer. You'll of course have to protect them from frost if you plant them very early. I think Mark showed some of those covers you can use just to kind of keep it healthy. It's also important to rotate beds where you plant your squashes, because the pest overwinters in the soil. So if that's one reason it's important to take the vines out when they die, and to rotate every 2 or 3 years. So you can hopefully avoid the larva getting into your vines. And even if you don't have this problem, as soon as your vines are done and you've harvested, remove those and destroy them as soon as possible. And there are some squashes, zucchini and pumpkins have real problems with this, but butternut squash, if you really like squash and when you grow it, is more resistant to the vine borers. So that is an alternative that you could grow.